I'm Erik Robelen from EWA, was for many years the Education Week before that. It's good to see some of my colleagues in the audience. So I've just been here for a couple of months. So just made the switch. And I have a panel here today where we've got a couple of folks from the Center on Education Policy joining us. We have Maria Ferguson, the Executive Director, and Diane Stark-Rentner, who is the Deputy Director? Okay, Deputy Director. Great. And just to give you a little bit of background on them and their organization, Maria's worked with a number of organizations over time, including the Alliance for Excellent Education, National School Boards Association Foundation. She worked in the Clinton administration at the Ed Department Communications Office, and is also a former journalist. And Diane has worked with the Center on Education Policy since its founding in 1995. Some of you may remember it was founded by Jack Jennings, or at least he was the leader of the organization for many years. And I certainly talked to him countless times over the years, picked his brain, and I heard that he has a new book coming out soon. So you might want to ask about that later. And Diane did some previous work with the House Education Committee in Congress, and also at the National PTA and the Council of Chief State School Officers. And then just briefly, their organization, the Center on Education Policy, I think someone may have said in the last panel that there's not any research on implementation. Well, they're here to tell you, yes, there is. So they've been doing some deep dives and a lot of great survey work of state agencies and districts themselves with a nationally representative sample of school districts. And this can be really valuable data and information for you to mine to help support stories that you're working on or give you ideas. So we're going to let them do a little presentation about their work, and after that, I'm going to try to synthesize some of the other recent survey and polling data, and then we'll go to Q&A. So take it away.
So welcome, glad to have you here. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about CEP, mostly just for context. We are nonpartisan and non-advocating, and the reason why I stress that, and I want you to know that, is as an organization in Washington, it is pretty unusual to sort of not carry your agenda firm and hard. We try really to not take either side and just stay right down the middle, which isn't always easy, especially about contentious issues, but that is our sort of modus operandum. We try to provide actionable research and analysis. We're here housed within a university, and a lot of our university friends engage in long-term research, randomized controlled trial type research. We tend to do more what I would call short-term descriptive research. Our audience is really policymakers at the federal and the state level, the public, the media, and others who want to try and understand the real implications of policy on the ground. So we try and produce things with a fairly fast turnaround. A 10-year randomized controlled trial can be a little frustrating when you're trying to make policy based on some sort of implementation knowledge of what's happening on the ground. So that's sort of the niche we try and fill. We develop and disseminate products for maximum value, which I don't want to say is a nice way of saying we dumb down things, but having been a journalist, I understand how hard it is to process information, especially information about policy and stuff in education that is it's just thorny, and it can be complicated, and it can be really boring. So we really try and keep that in mind to really present information that people can, not just reporters, but that everyone can use a little bit more efficiently. So we've been focusing on the Common Core since 2010. Our work has been, as we said, mostly implementation research. There is a stunning lack of implementation work out there about education policy writ large. It is the most difficult work to get funding for, quite frankly, but we feel it's the most important in terms of feeding an appetite for actual evidence-based policymaking. So with the Common Core, that was what we really set our target on, and we've been focused at the state and the district level since 2010. All right, yeah, good. Okay, so our general approach for understanding the impact of the Common Core is what I say, avoiding the scrum and focus on issues that inform policy and practice. Andrew mentioned before about family arguments around the Common Core. That would fall into the category of the scrum, and the nasty Twitter fights, that would fall into the category of the scrum too. So we kind of try and avoid that. I don't want to say that we're wimpy about it and we don't sort of engage in debates about the Common Core. We do, but we feel like our value is to actually provide on-the-ground research about implementation, what state and district leaders are dealing with, the decisions that they're making, the things that we know are actually going to impact how the Common Core is implemented in individual places. I've only been with CEP for 2.5 years, but I reap the benefit of Diane and Jack's very hard and long work in terms of building trust among state leaders. State leaders may come and go, but CEP's reputation seems to stay intact, and I can take no credit for it. That was all their hard work, but what we've tried to do is really honor that. State leaders do tend to trust CEP. They know that we don't engage in gotcha. That's not really what our work is about. So when we put surveys into the field, which are often very long, our state survey was 41 questions, we do get a fairly high response rate, which is nice, because as we know, that helps legitimize the findings. And you guys know this better than anyone. There's a lot of stuff out there, and trying to figure out what really is representative and what isn't can be very difficult. And then finally, we do think ahead and plan for a research agenda. We really think about how the work we can do can contribute to a short and long-term research agenda for policymakers. So the fact that ESEA in every education bill is up for reauthorization right now, that's every major piece of education legislation up for reauthorization now. You like to think that the folks that are coming in with the new Congress are going to actually have something to look at when they're recrafting policy. It might help, right? So there's not a lot of that. So we try and think about what we do, how we can support that. Obviously, we're not the only ones who do that job, but we want to contribute in our own unique way. Okay, I'm going to shut up about CEP, and Diane is going to walk you through some of the stuff from our latest reports on the Common Core, which were district-based surveys of district leaders on a range of issues.
Alrighty. Well, as Maria said, we've been following the Common Core since 2010, and that's included 3 surveys of state officials, 2 surveys of nationally representative samples of school district leaders. So this most recent survey was administered in the spring of 2014, and we issued 3 reports based on those surveys in October of this year. And on the table, you have a summary, and the summary reflects all 3 of those reports. So I'm going to briefly run through some of the key findings that we found with our survey data. The slide up here answers one question: how do district leaders feel about the Common Core? And as you can see, the pie charts on this side of the slide, those are for the 2014 survey results. And 90% of district leaders agree or strongly agree that the Common Core are more rigorous than their previous state standards in math and English language arts. The pie charts on the other side show how they answered the question in 2011. So you can see there's been a shift of views on the Common Core among district leaders in the few years between the surveys. Another view sort of question that we asked about was whether or not the district leaders thought that the Common Core would lead to improved skills among students. And more than 3/4 of the district leaders said that they thought that they would lead to improved math and English language arts skills. And similar to the slide that's shown up here, the views have shifted. It was about 55% in 2011 that believed that the student skills would improve as a result of the Common Core, and now it's about 75%. We also wanted to learn about implementation. As we said, we have been doing implementation research, and we were able to dive deep into 2 key issues in particular. One is curriculum, and the other is professional development. You're going to hear this afternoon a lot about the testing. We heard some this morning, and this spring, the students are all going to be tested on the Common Core content, and particularly those in the consortia states. We're going to get into that a little bit later and talk about some of the district views on those consortia assessments. But with regard to curriculum and professional development, we wanted to know when the districts began teaching a Common Core aligned curriculum, and over 80% of district leaders reported that as of our survey time in the spring, they had already begun teaching a Common Core curriculum in their schools. But a bigger question is, when do they believe that all of their schools will be implementing a Common Core curriculum? And that's what this slide shows up here. It's about 1/3 of schools reported as of the spring that they'd already achieved this milestone. About another 1/3 expect to achieve it during this school year, the year that students are going to be tested. And then about 1/4 or so expect it to be in all of their schools in 2015-16 or later. So right now the landscape is that this school year about 1/3 of the districts are catching up to get it in all their schools, but in some school systems it's going to be next school year or later before they really have implemented the Common Core everywhere. With regard to professional development, we wanted to know how many teachers and principals had been reached by the Common Core professional development. And about 2/3 of district leaders reported that all or nearly all of their English and math teachers had received at least some Common Core related professional development. And about 80% of district leaders reported that all or nearly all of their principals had participated in at least some Common Core professional development. But another key question is, when do they expect that the teachers and principals will be, all of them will be adequately prepared to teach the Common Core? And a little disclaimer, we did not define adequately prepared. It was up to the district leader who answered the question, but we presume that it means that they had enough professional development, familiarity with the Common Core that they could go forth and teach students or lead the school. So similar to the finding about the curriculum, only about 1/3 of districts reported that as of last year, all of their math and English language arts teachers or principals were adequately prepared for the Common Core. About another 1/3 expect them to be prepared during this school year, and the remainder either anticipate that it'll either be this school year or later before all their teachers and principals are prepared, or they couldn't estimate when that would happen. All right, so sticking with this topic of curriculum and professional development, we wanted to know the sources. Who was developing the curriculum? Where were they obtaining it from? Who was providing the professional development services? We found that over 80% of districts are using local sources for the Common Core. And it's shown on this slide. This is not as pretty as the pie charts, but it's an informative table. About 2/3 of the districts report using teacher-developed professional development materials. About half are using curriculum materials developed by the district itself. And then less than 1/3 are working with other districts in the state to develop their Common Core materials. About 16 to 18% are using materials that have been developed by other districts in the state, and a very small proportion is working with or obtaining materials from districts across state lines. So what's important about this is often the opponents are saying that the Common Core is nationalizing education, it's local decision making is being taken away, but these survey results seem to indicate that much of this curriculum development is happening locally and often by teachers. With regard to professional development, we found similar results. State and or district-sponsored professional development services were cited by the greatest proportion of districts in our survey as their sources for professional development around the Common Core for teachers and principals. And the topics that are being addressed include Common Core content, instructional strategies, and the use of assessment data to inform instruction. And on the assessment front, again, you're going to hear more about that this afternoon. We wanted to look at the consortia-developed assessments and find out what district leaders thought about them, what impact they think they would have on instruction in their schools. We asked states similar questions on our state survey that was administered about a year before the district survey, and there's some interesting comparisons between the two. Now, if you look at this slide, the important column to look at is the too soon to tell responses. About half or more of the districts in the survey responded that it's too soon to tell whether the consortia-developed assessment will yield information that will inform instruction, do a better job of measuring high analytical and performance skills than their state's current assessments, be an improvement over the state's assessment, drive instruction in positive ways, meet the district's needs for student achievement information, or produce results that will be understood and used by teachers, parents, and students. So we take this to mean that districts are sort of taking a wait-and-see attitude about the assessments. While some may have participated in the pilot testing around the consortia test last spring, many haven't even seen the assessments, they're not familiar with them yet, they don't know what sort of results they're going to get. So they're sort of holding back their opinion on whether or not these are going to have a positive impact on instruction. When we surveyed the state leaders who had been more intimately involved in the development of these assessments, they were much more sure of the impact and the information that would result from the assessments and how it would improve instruction. So this may be an issue of more familiarity. Like a year from now, there may be a different view on it. Hopefully, if it works as proponents hope, it will provide good information that will improve instruction. But that's an issue we'd like to revisit. Implementation challenges. Our survey also looked at the challenges that the districts face. We asked them, where are you having troubles? What's going well? And probably this will come as no surprise to anybody who's covered the Common Core or generally has covered school districts. 85% or more of the districts cite as a major or minor challenge finding adequate resources to implement the Common Core, having adequate district staffing levels and expertise, identifying or developing curriculum, providing professional development, and finally, having enough time to implement the Common Core before consequences such as school accountability, teacher evaluation, all sorts of things like that are tied to performance on the tests. So that sort of echoes some of the issues that were heard this morning about resistance to the Common Core and teachers being concerned about how all of this was proceeding. And on the resistance, we have the slide on that as well. This was also in our set of questions about the challenges. And I think the panel this morning pretty well laid out all the issues that are going on with state legislatures introducing bills that might repeal the Common Core, or states taking pause on their implementation, local community uproar over the Common Core. So we wanted to know if this was affecting at all the way that districts were carrying out their implementation. And about 3/4 of the districts said that overcoming resistance to the Common Core from within the K-12 system, as well as from outside the education system, was posing a major or minor challenge to their implementation efforts. A little less than 2/3 cited concerns about state officials reconsidering the adoption of the Common Core or putting the implementation of the standards on hold. And then finally, many districts themselves are doing outreach around the Common Core. We heard in our state survey that states were doing many of these activities as well, but districts are meeting with parents and teachers and other stakeholders to inform them about the Common Core. And they said that those outreach activities were also posing a challenge to them. So there weren't many areas where the districts felt like, it was not a challenge, but they are proceeding nonetheless. So one final data point before I turn it back to Maria is state education agencies and their assistance to districts around the Common Core. In our 2013 survey of state officials, they said that they were doing many things, including offering professional development services. Some are providing curriculum frameworks. As I said, others are holding meetings with local officials about the new standards. And we asked district leaders about these activities that states said that they were providing. And generally, the districts concur that, yes, their state education agencies are providing this kind of assistance to them. And we asked about the helpfulness of the assistance. And about 1/3 of these reported that the services were helpful. About 2/3 or so responded that they were only somewhat helpful. And then a small percentage of district leaders said that the state services were not at all helpful. So this is a concern because I think there's lots of challenges ahead with districts in implementing the Common Core, and everybody needs to play the role and be strong leaders. And state education agencies told us in our survey of 2013 that they have capacity issues. They may have staff expertise, but they don't have enough money to implement the Common Core as they would like. They don't have enough staff in some instances, and I think maybe that's what you're seeing in the survey results, is that showing up at the district level where a lot are saying, yeah, it was kind of helpful, but it wasn't extremely helpful. So just another issue to maybe explore in your stories.
These are just the big issues to follow, at least that we've gleaned from our research and that we're sort of keen on following over the next year or two. The teacher preparation piece, obviously this is a very big issue with the Common Core, not just in the teachers that are currently in schools, but also the pipeline issue, schools of education. How are they preparing students for the Common Core? If they're preparing them for the Common Core, whether they're taking an attitude that, look, this is going to pass, we're just going to keep doing things the way we do it, and how that all conflates with the larger conversation of how we prepare teachers writ large. The materials, curriculum materials and instructional materials, I think the interest area here is how much it's still localized, considering we have a federalized system of education. That's not all that surprising, but is that going to change? Is it going to stay that way? How many are going to go with vendors? How many are going to sort of create something on their own? That would be, I think, very interesting for us all to see. A big conversation around the Common Core is this idea of comparability and economies of scale. Is that actually going to happen? I don't think we have any answers to that yet. Uncertainty regarding the assessments, of course, whether the districts will actually use those consortia tests, how the concern about what the scores are going to affect decision making, I think is something we're all interested in. The public opinion issue around test scores, of course, is going to be an issue. as our panel pointed out earlier, the macro issues, the other stuff that Andrew was talking about, high stakes teacher evaluation, political blowback in the federal role. And then one of the things that we're interested in, of course, because we're here on a college campus, is are institutions of higher ed going to be using the Common Core as a proxy for college and career readiness? We've seen a little bit of that in Washington State. You know, is that going to move forward? Is it going to be the same for private institutions or as public institutions? I think there's a lot of interesting debate around that, since all of this is lauded in college and career readiness. The institutions of higher ed are sort of important players here. So we'll see.
Thanks for the presentations there. So I'm just going to walk you through, I did a little bit of research for this about what other polling and survey data has to say about Common Core implementation issues. Or the real focus, though, of mine was on parent or public's opinion on the Common Core, as well as teacher opinions and views on the Common Core. And there's actually quite a few surveys over the past year. Some of them dive more deeply into Common Core issues. Some of them sort of toss it in a survey that deals with all kinds of other political issues. So the first thing is just to give you a quick ego boost. The power of the press is alive and well, and half of people are hearing about the Common Core through you. So newspapers, radio, TV, and so on. So just wanted to put that out there. Now, in terms of the question for the general public, have you heard about the Common Core? I sort of thought that, I know there's a lot of controversy around Common Core. I thought this might not be so hard to answer with confidence, but then there was the curveball from the PDK Gallup data there that you might see. Most of these surveys indicated that it was about half, maybe 40% of the public had heard of Common Core. The outlier is PDK Gallup. And I don't know why that is. It could be about something about how they asked the question. But in this case, I'm still a little baffled. Maybe in the Q&A we can discuss that. One of the polls, this was again of U.S. adults, was on, what's the views on Common Core? Is it good or is it bad? As with so much, as you can imagine, the phrasing of questions can have some impact on this, so you're going to see variation. As this poll shows, though, good policy 38%, not good policy 44%. So it's somewhat evenly divided, but a little bit, based on this poll, tilting towards the negative. And you also will see here some of the political divides, where it tends to be Democrats are more supportive of the standards, and Republicans and independents less so, significantly less so, based on the data from University of Connecticut. Here, this next slide is data from an Education Next survey. It's a nationally representative survey, about 5,000 people they polled. And you'll see a few important data points here. One of them is public support, it indicates, is dropping from about 65% positive to 53% positive. So it's down to now about half who like it, and then 26% who are opposed, and then a lot of people just can't decide one way or the other. You will also see here, though, again reinforcing the political divide, where Republicans tend to have their support has declined, so they tend to be more skeptical than Democrats. And it may be that the public shift was largely among Republicans, although if you look at the bottom right pie, it suggests that maybe teachers are part of, there's a lot of teachers in the country, maybe they're also part of that shift in opinion. Again, one other poll, this is a PDK Gallup, reinforcing the partisan divide, where Democrats 53% favorable, Republicans 17% favorable. In this case, the question may have influenced it to some extent. Do you favor or oppose having the teachers in your community use the Common Core to guide what they teach? Something about that language could be quite different for how people respond than if you just say, do you like Common Core or don't you like Common Core? Briefly, the PDK poll tried to get at some of the reasons behind both the support and the opposition, which is probably what we're all curious about. Where are they coming from when they say they don't like it? One of the leading response in terms of, or the most popular response to why the public might oppose it, is that a belief that it will limit the flexibility teachers have to teach what they think is best, at 65%. About half of them seem to think that the teachers in their community don't support Common Core. And finally, 40% who said the federal government initiated the Common Core, which is not true, although they did create some incentives. So, but in any case, that's one of the impressions that's helping to guide public opinion. As far as support goes, the strongest is the belief that the Common Core will help more students learn what they need to know, regardless of where they go to school. And another is that the student test results will help promote better understanding of what students have learned. The Education Next poll also looked at the, quote, branding issue with Common Core. They asked the same question describing the standards and asked for support or opposition. And in one version, they used the phrase Common Core. In the other, they took that out. And lo and behold, public support leapt from 53% to 68% when they decided not to mention Common Core. So the brand is definitely complicating things. And what's interesting, Maria and I talked about this before the session, it may also be important to keep in mind engaging some public opinion that in some states they don't use the Common Core label, so it may be that even parents, when they've heard about it, don't know that what you're talking about is Common Core. They just know these are the new state standards. So here's the survey, surveying the audience and the public portion of this, where Education Next decided to do a little true or false quiz with their survey, and they asked people, true or false, the federal government requires all states to use the Common Core standards. True, false, anybody? I guess most of you know that that is in fact not true, but about half the public, based on this question, thought that it was true. As I say, there had been some incentives connected with federal grants, but there's certainly no requirements. Another one, and this is an interesting issue that their survey, the CEP survey, gets at, is the question around instructional materials. And under Common Core, you know, states and local districts can decide which textbooks and educational materials to use. Only about half of the public believes that that's true. For teachers, about 3/4 believe it's true. So even some teachers think that, you know, the Common Core is requiring specific textbooks and materials. A recent survey from the Gates Foundation and Scholastic, they surveyed about 1,600 teachers. From my understanding, it was not nationally representative sample, but they did try to do some efforts to make it reflect the composition of the teacher workforce. They found, first off, that teachers saying that implementation is mostly or fully complete. So, you know, that puts us in a new position where presumably teachers would know more of what they're speaking about here because they're actually living it in their classrooms. And so, you know, about 65% now are saying that versus 46% a year ago. And as far as whether they're prepared for it, you can see now that about 79% of parents or teachers are saying that they are at least somewhat prepared. Getting to teacher opinion about the Common Core, it's pretty split at this time, depending on the poll you use. Gallup did a poll in August and September of this year of about 800 and some odd teachers. And as you can see, about 41% positive, 44% negative. And as you can see, I highlighted this very positive and very negative because I know pollsters always, or when people report on results, they always sort of generalize so-and-so are positive, X% are negative. But to me, there's a big difference between saying, you know, you're very positive versus somewhat positive. And so it's probably worth, you know, looking at that distinction, which may not be a subtle one. And what's striking too is that by school level, it seems that elementary teachers are the most positive. And then when you get to high school, about 49% actually are negative in their views of the Common Core. The Gates Scholastic poll also looked at this question, and they phrased it around whether teachers believe that the Common Core will help their students. And their data suggested that there has been a decline in that belief from about 57% in 2013 to 48%. So a little bit of slipping in the confidence teachers have that this is actually going to be good for their kids. That said, some other data, and this is going to be a hard slide for you to read, but I'll just basically tell you that about 83% of teachers who are in schools where implementation is deemed fully complete say that implementation is actually going well. So it seems that, the more this would suggest the more experience they have with Common Core, the more they like it. Borrowing from a headline of my former colleague Steve Sawchuk, familiarity breeds approval. You can see that when the Common Core is fully implemented, it seems that opinion is stronger. A couple of other, really just one last slide about teacher views, and we can dive a little bit more. There's, as I say, this Gates Scholastic study did a fair amount of diving into teacher impressions, and this recent Gallup poll did as well. But one of the interesting ones that caught my eye was around the standards rigor, and I think we heard from the district administrators about this. But as far as when you ask teachers, it seems that very few teachers would describe the Common Core as less rigorous. A lot of them, about half, see the English language arts as more rigorous, and about 40% about the same for math. The math standards seem to be seen as, by a larger share of teachers, as more rigorous at 60%. So just a few last things that I'd suggest to keep in mind as far as you're covering these issues is to use the survey data to support your coverage, whether it's giving you ideas for stories or just helping to buttress what you're finding, because so often, you go into a school or you run into 2 or 3 parents and you hear a perspective and you quote them and they get the big play in the story, and then you wonder, I wonder if that's representative or not. There's a lot of survey data out there that you can draw on, and in fact, we're going to have all of the surveys that I used here. We're going to have a link to all of them, so you can cherry pick, whatever one you want. But there's surveys of teachers, there's surveys of the public, multiple ones, and they can help inform, when you're trying to gauge what you hear from 1 or 2 teachers or parents, whether or not that seems to be consistent with the broader perspective. And then finally, of course, read the questions. If you're going to cite a survey question, read it, because you'll find sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes there's just little nuances of description about the Common Core that might tilt you positive or negative. And as I said too before, it's interesting that do pay attention to even the subtleties of the response. If it just says X% agree, you might want to look at the survey to find out if it says agree somewhat or agree strongly, because as I say, I think that there's a big difference there. And that can help kind of gauge the level of confidence or intensity of opinion. One very last point, which is just that I didn't present a slide on this, but I thought it was interesting that if it's true from most of the polling that about 40 to 50% of the public has heard of Common Core, just as one gauge, I think it was the University of Connecticut poll found that 95% had heard of No Child Left Behind. So it's interesting, even while there's been, we hear about it all the time, it has not sort of saturated to the level, apparently, of the No Child Left Behind Act, which of course has been around for a longer period of time. But I just thought that was a pretty interesting little nugget. So I'm going to step down now, and then I know that there was already one question, and we'll start there. Thanks so much.
Is there any way in these approval, disapproval polls that you showed to tease out the effect of the differing implementation in curricula across districts? So for instance, do districts where teachers are putting in a certain kind of curriculum approve of the standards in general more than in other districts? Or is there a way to, or was this done in such a way that they're really talking just about the standards?
I think it's really the latter. I'm not sure you could tease it out in any way that would hold up statistically. It's an interesting question. We had a lot of questions about our state survey related to this, but the state survey was anonymous. That's one of the reasons why we have such a high response rate, is because we can report what states are doing, but we don't name names, so to speak, and that really makes state leaders feel much more comfortable. I'm not a psychometrician, so I'd have to sort of do some digging and find out what kind of correlations we could make about that. It's a good question. And it certainly would be one of the things related to that we're interested in is doing case study work. It really allows you to get at some of these questions, to really map the interaction between decision making and things like choice of curriculum, and then eventually when outcomes can be part of it. It's still too early for that. you can sort of start piecing together what are the conditions for success, if you will, depending on how you choose to define it.
Curriculum has been developed in a thoughtful way that teachers would be more inclined to think favorably about the standards.
Yeah, and if they had skin in the game, right? I mean, if teachers want to be part of their curriculum, they're intimately connected to it. So if it's foisted down on them, I think history has shown that usually doesn't work too well. But if they're part of the process, things do seem to go smoother. So I know there's lots of long-term research areas like this that people are thinking about now for the Common Core. So it's a great question.
If I can just add one thing to that, because I know this came up, I think, on the last panel, and we were talking earlier. There was a study out of Tennessee, that Vanderbilt University did, where they asked all kinds of questions to contextualize opinions about the Common Core, including whether it starts to get, affected by teacher morale or teacher, viewpoint on other issues that are somehow connected to the Common Core, whether it's the testing or the use of the testing. So there's a lot of things that can kind of influence what might be the opinion, the general opinion or perception they have of the Common Core. Or, there's my neighbor who, I had dinner with, and she mentioned something about the Common Core. And she said, yeah, and all that testing is just terrible. I can't believe the testing that the Common Core requires. And I said, well, it doesn't require it, but it's connected to it.
Right. I mean, the one thing I will say about that, about what your question is, and we tend to get, I think, a little high and mighty sometimes about this at CEP, is the extrapolation factor. So like when you do a survey, what you choose to sort of talk about as those, based on those survey results, I think some people take great license in terms of how they extrapolate survey findings. We try and sort of really push ourselves and say, okay, what information does this show us? And that's what we're going to report on, and that's our box. And we're going to try not to go beyond that box, as tempting as it may be. So, to make those kinds of connections that you're talking about, I know I would say for us, we just want to make sure that if we're doing it in a way that's legit. That it's not just our opinion, that there's actually some weight to it.
Hi, I'm Maeve Ward with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to answer your question by going back, Erik, to a slide that you showed. I worked on the Scholastic poll, and there are two ways to answer your question that are in the data, and one of them you did show. First, the longer a teacher has had the opportunity to work with the Common Core, the more optimistic they are about it, the more they believe in its potential to help students, which I think is important. And you can see it if teachers have less than 1 year or 2 years, and then 2 or 3 years. So there really is a very causal line in terms of experience. And the other impact we saw is that when teachers have an opportunity to participate in curriculum development, when they have an opportunity to choose instructional materials. So Maria, to what you were saying about when a teacher has some skin in the game, when they're able to participate in that process, that also really affects their feelings about the standards overall. Sorry to jump in.
So I had a related question, and Erik, you sort of hinted at this when you talked about your neighbor, but I'm wondering what the data tell us about how much of the public's resistance to the standards is about what's being taught versus the fear of testing or the testing that they are seeing in their schools already.
That's a great question. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this, how we can contribute to this idea of the testing issue, which we feel is going to be just like a very dominant issue in the next 2 years. And I always think of it as like an eddy, like in water, that it has the ability to just wrap everything around it and take it right down. So we're not sure how to answer that question for ourselves yet in terms of being able to separate the two out, but that's exactly what the conversation around the Common Core is now, much to your neighbor's point, is it always seems to focus on testing.
Yeah.
And it just seemed to turn on a dime like that. I don't know if the rest of you find that. I get many phone calls from reporters where they ask me questions about testing, about the opt-out movement, trying to understand whether it's what's the expression, sound and fury, like what if it's real or if it's not. So I think that's, if the Common Core didn't challenge reporters enough, I think the testing issue is going to really be a humdinger of trying to parse out.
And both of our surveys, the state and district survey, show that districts and states are trying to reach out and get ahead of the curve about the test results, that, it will be different than on the previous state test. students may be scoring lower, so they're trying to get ahead of it. But I think really this spring, when the test results start to come out, there'll probably be another little bump of, maybe a big bump of opposition or fury around the Common Core because of the test results, because it is supposed to be harder, much harder. So
I did have one thing I could add. There was yet another slide I had thought about adding, but I already had way too many. But I can't even remember which survey, but one of the surveys asked parents about their confidence in standardized testing and did they want more standardized testing. And in fact, they were pretty leery. I think it was something, if I can remember, 50 or 60% of parents who were questioning the value of the standardized testing that their kids get. So I do think it's safe to say that there are quite a few people out there wondering, about, and they tend to hear about all this testing. They'll hear those mantras. There's been some interesting research recently. This morning at Center on American Progress, they had a study earlier this year about how much time kids actually spend on testing and whose tests are they anyway, which, by the way, I think could be a fascinating story in any of your communities. When you hear this rhetoric or this criticism about the amount of testing, to try to figure out, okay, how much testing is there? Who's requiring it? Is it from the state? Is it from the district?
Context.
Yeah, exactly. It could be really interesting. And I know, some districts may be rethinking some of it as the new testing comes online, whether there's any redundancy.
Hi. I was interested, I think you said 80% of the district leaders said that they're using local sources for professional development. Was that right?
Right.
Do you have any way of comparing that to what it was before? Because one of the things I have found, ironically, in talking to some of the teachers I have, is that it seems to be making PD more local, that there was a sort of a reliance on bringing in outside experts. And among some teachers, not just for PD, but for curriculum materials, they feel like the textbook companies and the sort of professional circuit of PD people were kind of in charge of what they were doing in schools for years, and this is a relief. So how does that compare to previously?
Well, we don't know the answer to that question directly, but that's a great story to dive into. But I think that's sort of an odd situation where there's been a lack of sort of the test publishers coming in with the textbooks and driving it because of the big change to the Common Core. So then by necessity, the school districts, the teachers started developing their own. So it may indeed be the case that you point out that it is a more locally driven system, even with the overlay of common standards, than before, when a textbook publisher came in and said, oh yes, this textbook is aligned to your state standards. Whether or not it really was is a different question, but that would be a great area to dive into just to see how different it is or the same.
I just want to piggyback to ask you guys, because one of the things that I found fascinating in your survey was on this question of instructional materials. And there seemed to be, kind of along the same lines, this suggestion that a lot of these materials right now, they're not getting from publishers. They're finding themselves, they're getting from other districts or from the state. And that sounds really interesting. Do we have any idea whether that's a big shift? I know there's a lot of turmoil in the publishing world right now around open education resources, and the notion of common standards creating the possibility where a school district in New York could borrow from Arizona. But I'm just kind of wondering what you make of the suggestion also in your survey that there's a lot of homegrown or home-picked stuff coming out that's not necessarily from the big publishers.
One of the things that I've always found fascinating about the whole Common Core thing is this idea of economies of scale. I'm a kind of an economics nerd. So this idea that because of open resources and because of the commonness of the Common Core, you really can get this sense of cross-state collaboration amongst teachers. Because, to me, that's where it all starts, right? They're the ones who tend to be the ones who are most, if you will, scrappy about this kind of stuff. They will figure out a way to make it work. So, it'll be interesting to see. I think it's still too early to tell, but we know that teachers really do get frustrated. There definitely has been, I don't know if it's formal research or survey work about this idea that the textbook companies sort of run everything in a school district. It'll be interesting to see if this sort of changes that dynamic and how they respond to it. I think we don't really know yet, but there's definitely something happening out there. So.
One of the data points in the slide about the local sources of curriculum, it was only about 11% in math and 8% in English that were using curriculum materials developed by districts in other states. So I was kind of surprised at that. I really thought you'd see a lot more collaboration across states, and even our state survey sort of showed that as well, that they're still sort of keeping it local. You know, and maybe that's the way that they figure that their teachers are learning the standards too. I mean, it's a process of, if you have to go in and develop curriculum or professional development, you're going to learn the content of the standards along the way as well. But it will be interesting also to see after the tests are administered in the spring, if there's a tweaking of all of that next fall. Like if they see areas where they were weak on, what they need to improve on, how that's kind of a constant process and what they're doing in the future based on the test results.
More questions?
Yeah, Erik, you sort of stole my question, but I have a very particular question about that survey question, because it doesn't seem like you asked whether you're using off-the-shelf materials, just if you're developing curriculum materials. So
We did.
I assume those districts and schools could still be using a Pearson textbook, but teachers are developing some curriculum around that. It doesn't mean that teachers are exclusively developing the curriculum. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I'd heard someone has been saying to me, for example, that everyday math is used in like 60% of school districts, and I don't know if that's accurate, but I'm curious if those places are also using, regular textbooks.
We did ask about for-profit and nonprofit sources of curriculum, and it was smaller percentages. I'm getting there. 39% in math and 35% in English are using materials developed by for-profit entities, and 14% in math and 13% in English are using materials developed by private nonprofit organizations. And so districts could select a number, like it wasn't, what are you using one thing, they could select all that applied, but they were still surprisingly low in my mind. I thought you'd see a lot more of the, especially for-profits, given the history of textbooks and all that only 39%, 35% are using materials developed by for-profit organizations.
We got up here.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I work for Politico in town, and I cover a lot of Common Core surveys, especially in a daily newsletter that I write. And I think I have a more high-level question for you guys, but so many of these surveys are so obviously skewed depending on where they're coming from, not from the Center on Education Policy. I think you guys are very middle of the road, but I see a lot of them that are very, very, it's definitely, if it coming from one specific point of view. So I kind of wonder, what is the value in covering a lot of those surveys? I mean, is it just because people want to read about them? I mean, even when you're writing about the way the study was conducted, the questions, I mean, what's the value in I guess, reporting all the noise, or is there a value?
Well, I mean, we talk a lot about this as well. To me, there's, survey work doesn't, when you're amongst real researchers, survey work doesn't really fall into the category of research. If they're nice, they'll call it descriptive research. If they're not nice, they'll call it a lot worse. But there's that, but then there's advocacy. And a lot of the survey work that's out there is really, it's a tool for advocacy. It's people have a point of view and they're advocating their point of view, and their survey is going to support that point of view. And you can ask certain questions, and it's not that they're being disingenuous. This is what they're doing. Obviously, we don't do that, but it is very hard to separate the noise, if you will, or the static of all that other survey work from the stuff that is more legitimate. We're all here talking together, so I might be a little bit more honest about that. It's frustrating sometimes to be in that, but that's the way it is. So I think the onus, and unfortunately, it puts the weight on you guys as reporters to really dig deep. And I'll tell you, with our district, only one reporter asked me, "Who funded you?" It's a very legit question. I cannot get pissed off by that question. It's very legit, and I told her exactly, well, we were funded in part by the Gates Foundation and in part by Collaborative for Student Success, and she asked me a whole bunch of questions about whether I was pressured and da-da-da-da, and I answered her very honestly. So for me, for us, where we stand, transparency is the only way. That's the only way that you can sort of assure reporters, who quite frankly are due that assurance, that, this is who we are and this is what we do, and then it's up for y'all to judge. But it's very hard. I mean, it's hard for us, and I'm sure it's even harder for you. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but that's at least our take on it.
I'll just chime in briefly that, again, we all, will from time to time just write the quick story about the latest poll, But over time, there can be the ways that you can kind of go through some of the different data and figure out how it might inform your reporting on a particular issue, or even give you ideas for a story. You know, oh, the survey data seems to be saying that the reason parents don't like Common Core is because of this. Let me kind of chase that down. Or maybe you find an interesting finding around the instructional materials that says, oh, I'm going to figure out in my district, you know, what materials are they using? You know, how did they pick them? How do they know they're aligned? So there may, and then in that story, you know, paragraph 7, you throw in, meanwhile, a recent study found, and it just gives you a little bit of that support that you can explain why this matters and why, you know, it's not just you talking about this one local school, but the larger context. With that, we're actually out of time. Thank you so much, Maria and Diane, for your presentations. We'll take a short break.